Okay, so the plan for today is to show you guys how to make a really simple but really cute looking little apron. The reason for this is twofold, threefold, a couple of reasons fold. I always forget how many reasons there are. First one, Christmas comes but once a year, and it involves a lot of presents. So everyone's getting aprons for Christmas this year. Spoiler alert. Second reason is, well, you've just watched me, not last week but the week before, going through all of my fabric stash. I need to use it up on something. Aprons are super. This pattern uses less than a metre of fabric, depending on the width obviously, but yeah, less than a metre of fabric on every fabric that I've used, which to be fair have all been 150 centimetres wide, so there's that. Yeah, pretty simple introduction. Let's get on with the sewing. So the first job is to mark out all of my pattern pieces. I'm using a thick linen for this, or a thick cotton. I'm not exactly sure what it is because it comes from my stash. So I've got it folded in half for the apron and the bib. Obviously I only have a pattern piece for the bib and the lining. That's because everything else is just rectangles. So I have the measurements written out on the bib and I just use those to mark it out every time. You have to cut out 3 different pieces for the strap. I'm cutting out 4 here because I actually made 2 aprons at the same time but only recorded 1. So the piece that's cut out underneath isn't going to waste. And obviously once all the pieces are marked out or pinned down, I can cut them out quickly. I also like to mark the wrong side, which you can see me doing on a couple of them. That's because this material is really difficult to see which side is right and which one is wrong. So even though there isn't necessarily a right and wrong side on it, I want to make sure that everything is the same way around. So I just mark one side on it, all of them, so I know that when I put them together, they're all the same way around in the end. The next step is marking out the pockets on a complementary cotton. Again, there's no pattern piece because it's a simple rectangle, so I'm just using the measurements that I have written down on the bib to draw them out. The reason I use a contrasting fabric for the pockets is that I've tried to do it pattern matching. I regretted it, it took forever because you have to get them folded in and everything. It's just so much easier to use a contrasting fabric and then you don't have to worry about pattern matching, because I'm simple. And now the joys of not having a sewing space. Here I am just preparing everything to sew. And now I just have the last piece to cut out, which is completely unnecessary. It's a contrasting band for the top of the bib. That's because I want this to match with 2 different aprons, so that's why it's different from the pockets. It's not necessary, so I don't have a pattern piece for it, so I'm just marking out a rectangle that's the same shape as the top of the bib, and then I'll chop off what isn't needed. It's not the most fabric saving way of doing it, but it works perfectly fine for me. Here I'm preparing to trim the excess to allow for the band. I've measured where I wanted to go, and then allowed 1.5 extra centimetres on both pieces for the seam allowance. What I forgot to do was add an extra seam allowance on the top of the band so that when I folded it down I could stitch in the ditch so that it wasn't visible. So instead, off camera, I whip stitched it to the seam allowance of the join. So with the bib and the strip ready to go together, it's just a quick running stitch to attach those 2 on the machine. And then obviously I need to press those seams open and prepare it to be stitched down. You can see here what I meant about not, well, you can't see it, but this is what I meant about not giving enough to be able to stitch in the ditch, so this is where I just had to stitch it down by hand. The next thing I like to prepare is the straps, because pressing these takes forever and I like to get it out of the way. So the first thing to do is to sew all 3 strips together to make one long strip. Then obviously you need to press the seams open. Once all of your seams are pressed open, then you need to press the strip in half as if you were making bias binding tape, and then open it up again and fold each side in to meet the center. It's really like making a great big long piece of bias tape, but obviously it's not cut on the bias. You also need to fold in each end so that there's no raw ends on the end. And once that's all pressed, I like to press it again just to make sure everything's folded down neatly. Then you just sew the open ends together so you end up with one long stretch. Next job is to start on the apron proper, or at least the pockets for it. So first of all, I fold down the top of the pockets by 6mm, and then again to meet a 4cm mark. So with that done, I can mark the seam allowances and pin them down. I like to tack them down because it makes it a lot easier to attach the pockets to the apron if you're not worrying about pins having to go through multiple layers. To meet the corners, I cut them off at an angle. You then fold the corner in, and once you turn around the edges, it should meet into a nice corner. And once it's basted in place, you can sew the facing down, which just involves a top stitch. Now that the pockets are ready to go on, I just need to get them onto the skirt. So the first thing to do is to measure up from each corner and get it in straight. And because I've basted them down, I don't need to worry too much about lots of pins. I can just put in a couple in to hold it in place. The other pocket goes in the same place on the other side, nice and square again, and again just pinned in place. And then once again, it's just a top stitch on the machine as close to the edge as you possibly can. Once the pockets are sewn on, I also put in place 3 gathering stitches, so that's 3 stitches on the largest setting possible, so that I can gather the skirt up once I've got the pockets finished. And once that's sewn down, you can take out those basting stitches and get rid of those. Before gathering the skirt, I like to measure the seam allowance on. So again, it's 1.5cm in from the edge, and I just mark all of those down. The other thing to do is to tie off 2 ends of the gathering stitches, so that when I come around to gathering those are already secure. And the last thing to do before starting to gathering it is to measure out the halfway point, then measure 4 centimeters in from each side so that the gathers aren't too close to the edge on each skirt. And then in between that 4 centimeter mark and the middle point, mark another middle point so you've got the quarters as well, and again on the bib as well, so you can match them up so you know where you're gathering to on each side. Because we're doing a French seam on this, we then pin it wrong side to wrong side and pin each of those 4 marks that we've just measured, so the middle points, the quarter points, and 4 centimeters from the edge. And then with those 2 in place, you can start gathering them down so that the skirt matches the length of the bib. I like to try and pop through the top 2 gathering stitches, because then I'll use the 3rd gathering stitch to sew the French seam, so the other seam for the French seam once this is done, which is why I do 3 gathering stitches rather than the normal 2. And then obviously the next job is to press that seam. Because we're doing a French seam, we need to get rid of as much bulk as possible, so once that's pressed, I'll just trim it down as close as I can. Again, that first gathering line comes in really helpful because I find that's about the right place to trim it down to. And with that all pressed and cut down, you can then pin it again. This time you flip it the normal way around. You're pinning the right side to the right side, which will then give you an enclosed seam on the inside, which means that seam that's against the body and very visible because it's an apron is going to be enclosed. It's not going to go anywhere, and it's nice and neat and tidy. So once that's all pinned again, then you can just pop it through the sewing machine on another running stitch. Again, trying to keep it as close as possible. I then use the bottom gathering line and the middle gathering line to stitch those, and again that should be in just about the right place. So once your French seam is finished, you can press that and then get rid of all of the excess thread from your gathering stitches. The next job after that is to roll your hems. So now you've got a complete apron. You're going from the bottom of the armpit all the way down and then along the bottom of the skirt. Again, to make the corners, I cut it off on an angle, then fold that in, and then fold the 2 on either side, and they should meet up nice and neatly in the middle. And once that's all pinned, it just goes through the machine on another top stitch as close to the edge of the hem as possible. Once your hem's finished, the next job is to start preparing the linings. So the first job is to stitch a line 6mm from the edge of the long side of the lining. This is to help you press it in, which is, trust me, very difficult to do on a curved hem without it. So once that's stitched, you can then take it over to the ironing board and just roll that under once. And once that's pressed, I like to then go over it with a zigzag stitch, because although that won't be visible, it's going to be exposed to the moving strap. So I just like to know that it's not going to fray on the inside. Once your lining's prepared, the next job is to pin it to the inside of the arm size. And you're back to doing normal seams, so this is right side to right side. The other thing that you need to do is to fold down the edges of the lining so that they are nice and neatly done. So this is just done with a quick rolled hem, and I find this easiest to do when I've already pinned it to the arm size, because then I can get it exactly to the right length of the apron. So to do that, what I recommend is pin it down, take out the two last pins, roll down the edge of your lining so that it matches to the apron exactly, and pop a pin in there, sew that down, and then pin the last two pins back in, and now everything should meet up nice and neatly. And then obviously pop it under the sewing machine on another running stitch. And once those are sewn in place, then you want to understitch it. So this is sewing the seam allowance to the lining part rather than the front part. And this just helps to make sure that when you press it, none of that's going to be visible on the outside. And then you can take it over and press that down. Then I trim the excess, and again I just zigzag that just to protect it, because it will be against the moving strap and I don't want it to catch or start fraying or anything on the inside. Once that's all neatened up and ready to go, the next thing is to flip it inside and pin it down. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be top stitching where you pressed it earlier with the line on the inside down to make a lining for the strap to go through. What I find is easiest to do is to flip it over and pin it down near the actual seam, and then pin it again on that folded under bit, and then just sew that down with a top stitch as close as you can to the end of the lining. The other thing to remember when you're sewing the lining down with the top stitch is that in this case, because I've got that different coloured strap on the top, I need to swap the thread out halfway along, otherwise I'm going to end up with a dark blue line through the light blue strap. So obviously, if you're using a complementary fabric that you don't need to swatch out the thread for, that's not an issue, but just keep it in mind that it will be visible on the outside, so you need to try and keep it as neat as possible, and you need to match the threads as neatly as possible. So with those two lining pieces in place, that's it, you're completely done. The last thing to do is to thread the strap through, and the easiest way to do that is to pin a safety pin through it and then use that to lead it through. It just gives you something to pull on and pull it through with. So that's all now done. Here's the finished apron and the other ones that I made to match. Like I said, this is a really simple project. I think that if I did it without filming and only making one at a time, it would take me less than 6 hours. This is after making 8 of them, but I'm quite a slow sewer, to be honest. So yeah, 5 to 6 hours. It's definitely an afternoon project rather than a couple of days project. It's a really simple design, but it's got a couple of nice features. That drawstring, so you can adjust the sizes of it, or the drawstring kind of strap thing, so you can adjust the size. It's super. I am so glad that I decided to use a French seam on them, because it's just so nice and neat on the inside. So yeah, I've made 8 of these now, really happy with them. Hopefully they'll be useful for you, and if you did like it, please think about giving me a like or maybe adding me to your subscriptions. Thank you to everyone who's done this so far, I really appreciate it. And the question that I'm asking you guys today is, what are you making people for Christmas? Are you sewing something? And related to that, but not really, what do you do to use up your stash? I've still got a lot of stuff to go through. Any ideas? Let me know down below, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you. Bye.